Hello, everybody. Welcome to City Lights. And to those of you online, welcome as well. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. I'm going to take a moment at the beginning just to pay our respects to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we are delighted to have Elwin Cotman, who is an amazing storyteller, someone who has been followed here at City Lights by much of our staff for many years, and we are delighted to be celebrating this fantastic new collection called Weird Black Girls, and it is published by our friends over at Scribner Books. Elwin is the author of 3 collections of short fiction. These include the Jack Daniels Sessions EP, Hard Times Blues, and Dance on Saturday. His debut novel, The Age of Ignorance, is going to be published by Scribner in 2025. His writing has appeared in the Grist, Electric Lit, BuzzFeed, The Offing, amongst others. He holds a BA from the University of Pittsburgh and an MFA from Mills College here in Oakland, California. You can see him on Substack. And doing the honors tonight, we are really honored to have Lisa D. Gray, who's a writer, curator, and social justice advocate and warrior. She is the founder of Our Voices, Our Stories SF, a literary event where women of color engage with the community. She works regularly with equity-focused organizations seeking to make the world a better and more just place. We're going to be having a signing at the end. We're also going to have a little Q&A towards the end of the discussion. For those of you online, we have posted links with which you may purchase the books. You may also throw your questions, comments, praise in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. You may also want to switch over to speaker view. Welcome to you both, and welcome to City Lights.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out. So I should start with the reading. All right. Well, I want to start off saying, free Palestine in the genocide. This is from a story in my book called Things I Never Learned in Caitlin Clark's Intro to Acting Class. Today I wear eyeliner, cheetah print pajama pants, hype sneakers, and a pink crop hoodie under which my long, narrow torso greets the world. I look fabulous. Come to Bloomfield, where bags of uncollected garbage sun ripen and rupture in alleys and where weeds break the cobblestone like zombie fingers. On my way to the Hollow, where I intend to smoke indica on one of the secret stairs built into the hillside, a place to think, I detour through the back door into Crazy Mocha. Longer than it is wide, the cafe has a video rental section in the back, inscrutable sketches from some local artist on the wall, a creepy old man in a long dung-colored t-shirt who sits by the supply closet all day with a managerial glower, yet he works neither there nor anywhere. And at the front of the store, a crescent-shaped counter bulwarked in tall bottles of artificial sweetener. Like a basic bitch, I order a latte. Through the 3-paneled window, I notice 3 old men in red chairs around their little table, sipping cappuccino, and recognition brings animosity. These wannabe sopranos think themselves hard holding down the Little Italy franchise of a corporate coffee chain with a dozen identical stores. Once in college, they called me a moolie, one of 2 obvious insults they could have thrown my way, so maybe they opted for the more traditional one. So I returned with a group of queers to let them know, in no uncertain terms, they could become better acquainted with that sidewalk they like to occupy if they kept fucking with us. And because they're softer than the ice cream that spirals out the spigot at Old Country Buffet, they shut up and took it. Part of me wants to read them for old time's sake, but annoyingly, ages make me cautious about scaring white folks. So I take my latte to the wall, and a chair and a table that are Spirit Airlines levels of uncomfortable. From my red Gucci purse, I fish a sketchbook. Then, on the first available page, I write racist in blue gel pen with an arrow pointing down, about to ask the barista for tape when I lock eyes with a man across the aisle. He hesitates before standing. His reluctance confuses me because we're both clearly gay, myself particularly. Only thing straight about me are my edges. I invite him with a rueful smile. Chubby, dark, and genially handsome with a clean-shaven face, he approaches, remains standing at a respectful distance. His eyes are charcoal gray. He says he performed with Sonia Sanchez at the Kelly Strayhorn Theater, and after a moment I realize he is referencing the book sticking out of my purse, Autumn Blues. Named Leroy, he pronounces it Leroy, like a French word. How pretentious, I think. How delightful. I ask him to sit. I wonder what detergent keeps his brown pleated sweaters so fluffy. After he sits, we pass some minutes in desultory conversation. We discover we graduated the same class at Pitt. Sophomore year, we both took Intro to Acting. My professor was Douglas Pona, a character actor / Al Sharpton lookalike who maintained a lighthearted class. Lots of improv exercises, lots of talk about Cuervo and weed. Pona's a sweetheart, Leroy says, starry-eyed. I did Shakespeare in the Park with him 2 years ago. I notice his hands are soft. His striated nails shine like piano lids. I had Caitlin Clark for Intro. She was a pretty big name. What was she in? I ask. Remember that show Moonlighting? Asks Leroy. With Bruce Willis? You have to call it Moonlighting with Bruce Willis, like that's the whole title. I like to think of it as Moonlighting with Sybil Shepherd. This is going great. She did Broadway, he continues. She was in a movie called Dragon Slayer, I think. Saying the name, he smirks, because what a cheesy title, right? I slam both palms on the wax tabletop, startling him against the back of his seat. I demand to know, did she play Valerian or Princess Elspeth? He sounds warily intrigued. The princess, I believe. My nigga, you don't even know. That was my shit when I was little. My pulse clangs like an alarm because somehow I know she portrayed Valerian. Leaning close to Leroy, I declare Dragon Slayer classic 80s fantasy. The premise, killing a dragon is very, very hard. Charged with the task is the wizard's apprentice, Galen, played by Peter McNichol. No feather-haired beauty like Mark Hamill in Star Wars, but an average, insecure, slightly effeminate kid whose safety I, a child in front of my wood-sided Panasonic babysitter, would fret for during commercial breaks. Watching plots and counterplots unfold as peasants, warriors, and royalty each pursued their solution to mankind's secondary status on the food chain, the moral ambiguity on display stretched my black and white mind to gray putty. The dragon's name was Vermithrax Pejorative, I tell Leroy. How cool is that? What a name, he exclaims. All through my monologue, he's had the knuckles of 2 fingers on his throat. At first, I assume my attentions have him checking his pulse, and these narcissistic thoughts embarrass me. Then I realize that's exactly what he's doing. I tell him about Galen's friend Valerian, a husky-voiced boy with cautious eyes. In a shining example of 80s PG rating, a skinny-dipping trip with Valerian leads Galen to discover his friend's buoyant breasts. Her whole life, she dressed as a boy to avoid the lottery through which, on the king's orders, virgin daughters were sacrificed. I thought it was so cool the love interest was androgynous, I say. As a femme, I know it was formative, and Galen loves his girl. He chooses her over the princess. It's kind of dorky, but I write fanfic about them going on adventures. It's the first time I've told that to anyone other than my mom. That is charming, Leroy compliments. Speaking of femme, you must tell me what nail polish you use. Maybelline. I present my cherry nails for his inspection. Boy, this shade be giving me life. It looks so much more expensive than it really is. Unexpectedly, Leroy replies with a grunt that shivers me in its carnality. You know she was from Pittsburgh, he says. Who? I ask from the depths of distraction. The whirls in my brain of violet cloud. Professor Clark. That don't surprise me, I reply. She didn't have the accent. In medieval fantasy land, actors in Ren Fair costumes employed a variety of awful British dialects that ranged from laughable but noble attempts at posh, Chris Sarandon in The Princess Bride, to none at all, Tom Cruise in Legend, to Matthew Broderick in Lady Hawk, playing a Frenchman with a Cockney accent while sounding like a kid from the Valley, to Christopher Lambert playing a Scotsman with a French accent in Highlander. Caitlin Clark made up for her awkward inflection with her earnest recital of lines like, "You're going to die, you know," or "I can see why you love the princess. She's very beautiful." She performed the character as someone grown angry and fragile from a life of hiding. I doubt any role she played before or after equaled that of a dragon-slaying Yinzer trans man. Sorry for rambling, I rushed to say. I wish I took her class. He frowned with his whole face. She would have loved to hear that. Rest in peace. My heart contracts. How'd she die? Ovarian cancer. Shit. I know, right? She died in 04, the year I took intro to acting. He continues in a choked voice. She really helped cement my love of acting. I was just reading lines for an audition. Always on that grind, he adds with forced amusement. Lately, I've been fashioning my life into a rebellion against America's obsession with hustling, grinding, whatever they call it these days. When people ask me what I do, I refer to myself as a bum who smokes too many cigarettes and recreationally reads Ralph Ellison essays at the CMU library before finding a restroom in which to recreationally masturbate. At 26, I'm young enough to fall in love from a gesture, and the dewy sadness in his eye does it. Rimmed in long lashes, his irises, of which the right contains more bronze than the left, halo my smitten visage. I reach across the table for his shea-soft hand, and I'm struck by a force that numbs my jaw and vibrates down through my chest. I'm flicked like a pesky mosquito out of my own skin. I fall through blackness until I come to a stop that jars the soles of my feet and rattles my teeth. Leroy has vanished. In his place, a dozen young adults sit in a circle of folding chairs in a basement with windows set high and white featureless walls. At one end of the room stands a black Steinway surrounded by music stands like a cluster of skinny groupies. The other end has three-tiered wooden seating decorated with tasseled pillows. My hands are now 4 shades darker, longer, fingers thicker, the nails manicured. At the head of the circle sits a slender woman in a black turtleneck, dark blue jeans, and leather boots. Curly black hair rests across a broad plane of her shoulders. Her nose is long and bold. Her cheekbones, like slashes, pulse artificially with blush. Her rouged lips resemble twin mountains on the shore of a bay. Large and tired, her eyes shimmer darkly, deceptively blue. A cry for help crackles down my brainstem to disintegrate on the back of my studious tongue. Realizing where and who I am, my spine jolts. His spine. I scream without sound. Even panic has been robbed from me. The heart in his chest beats calmly, like the dumb organ it is. 2 pieces of advice, says Caitlin Clark in a low, hoarse voice. 1, no matter the role, that part helps create the fabric of the story. In the movies, of course, I'm first and foremost a stage actress. In the movies, I always played the girlfriend, the prostitute, the girl who gets killed. But those roles were just as important as a lead role. 2, look for yourself in your characters. In Dragon Slayer, I played a girl pretending to be a boy. Was that hard? As both thought and words, his voice blasts between my ears. I grit my non-existent teeth, thinking, idiot, that's your Dragon Slayer question? The professor purses her lips at our interruption. Before she can speak, she bends at the waist and coughs into her fist. I shudder. His salivary buildup starts to choke me, and when he swallows, it makes a sound of snow falling off the roof, a catastrophe in miniature. Well, I've never been a boy, she rasps after drinking from a thermos, but I wasn't a girl at the time either. I was close to 30 when I made that film. We all hide things, and that's how I found the character. Now think about the character you're portraying for your monologue. What would they wear? What is their background? In a conflict, how would they react? His hand moves a stubby library pencil across a notepad balanced on his corduroy knee. I watch his fingers write Troy fences at the top of the page, then proceed with lines of tight cursive. Trapped, I surrender to terror, screaming like an animal. I come to as if pulled from the water where I drown. Gravity tackles me face down on the pine wood floor, taking a table and 2 scoot-back chairs with me. On his feet, Leroy throws hands over his mouth. Oh my God, are you okay? How the fuck did you do that? I scream. Do what? People are staring at me like I'm crazy. Am I crazy? Breathing, trying to recenter, I snatch my wrist back from the stranger taking my pulse. Bitch, you'll know me. For a time, I expectorate the taste of dish soap from my mouth. I tell Leroy, it's the heat. He collects his satchel. It looks like you had a stroke. I'll take you to West Penn. I'm fine, sweetie. I reach to touch his cheek, but catch myself. After a torturous pause, he searches his satchel for a ballpoint pen and writes his number on the back of a receipt. He tries to appear calm, but the upper right corner of his lip quivers. I'm going to go, he announces, holding my gaze until the blood fizzes in my ears. But call me and let me know you're okay. Watching him leave, my mind's eye follows him to the sidewalk, where he berates himself, though he did nothing wrong. I sit back down. The barista asks how I'm doing. I lie and say I'm fine, and she commences mopping tea and spit from the floor. Over 3 years at Pitt, I probably crossed Caitlin Clark's path unknowingly. What was her class like? Would I have annoyed her with questions about some movie from her Betamax years? Would I have been wowed by her stage actor's acumen? Or would I have been petulant watching her phone it in, unaware the woman before me was her own ghost? I snatch at my purse and run after Leroy. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh.
I hope I didn't go too long.
No, that was great. Gave us a good sense of who that character is. And that's the beginning of the story.
Yes.
It gives us, like, what you read, I think, kind of squarely places us in who these two people are. So I'm glad that you read that, because I said earlier that is, I think, my favorite story in this collection. And one of the reasons I like it, as I said earlier to you, is that it is kind of a big list, and I'm a fan of lists, but it's also very funny. So talk to us a little bit about your use of, because you use lists throughout. It almost, there's probably three of the, there's 10 stories in the collection? Seven stories in the collection. So at least 4 of them use lists in interesting ways.
I wasn't aware that was a motif of mine.
Really? Let me tell you, it is. But also you use, like, these stories are funny. Talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about your use of humor. And how do you, because I find it very hard to be funny when I write. So talk to us a little bit about how you are able to, like, pull that humor out in these characters and in these situations that are really, like, poignant sometimes, like they're really serious situations, but you're finding a way to bring humor to them.
It's a good question. I definitely believe in structure. So I think something I unconsciously do when I set out writing a story, how many days does it take place over? Where is the set? Anything I can do to sort of restrict it so the story doesn't go off the rails, because you see, I write longer short stories. And I try to keep everything, 50 pages at the most. So I definitely look for that structure when I'm writing. I think a reunion is another one where I say what the topics of conversation are at the beginning of the piece, and then they talk about those issues, and then the story is over. And I think as far as humor, I've always been drawn to humorous writing and finding the humor in things. I think, like, I put out an essay today about Slaves of New York by Tama Janowitz, and that got me, which is a very humorous book. And that got me thinking when I was writing that piece about, the role that humor plays in my writing. And one thing that I put, it's serendipitous we're talking about this, is that some stories can only be told with humor, where some things, where the idea is that, like, pain is not inherently profound, and some people in this world really are shallow and boring, and the only way to actually tell those stories is to tell them in a humorous way, else there's nothing to talk about. It just comes off as bland. And I feel it's hard to sort of sit and intellectualize my use of humor, because it just comes naturally, I guess.
Okay. Are you just funny in general, do you think?
I'm a very funny man.
All right. I like that. Tell us a joke. No, just kidding.
I don't know. It's just, I whenever my characters start talking, it always sort of goes towards humor. But I also feel that's how people are.
Right.
You know, if we're in a situation we're feeling awkward, we want to make a joke. We want to impress people, we make a joke. So if my characters are just going through their lives, it starts leaning towards that end regardless.
Okay. I want to jump for a second to the end of the book and the acknowledgement section, because a couple of things stood out to me there. The first is that you reference a quote, one of my favorite Zora quotes, about some years asking questions and some years giving answers, right? What's this year giving you?
The questions or the answers?
Or is this year a year of questions, or is this a year of answers?
It's a year of answers.
Okay. Why?
I was wondering, is it worth it? You know, should I just go to medical school?
Oh, okay.
These are things I ask myself when I'm working on 2 books over the course of 2 years. I ask, am I going to make it to 40? I did. So there's an answer.
Here.
Thank you. I feel like things are coming together, and that's a quote I love too. You can see in the book, Zora actually makes a cameo in the book. There's 2 other stories, I think, where she's referenced. And Their Eyes Were Watching God is one of those novels where it's every single page has something where you can be like,
Definitely.
okay,
Yes.
this is the truth.
Yes. Yeah, this is one of those things you have to read over and over and over again, and you always find something new every time you read it. Yes. Tell us a little bit about, so the other thing that you mentioned in the acknowledgement section is that Gateskill is like your goddess of writing, right? So I want you to tell us a little bit about why Gateskill. Like, what is it about her writing that really resonates with you as a writer and as a reader?
I read Mary Gateskill for the first time when I was in undergrad at Pitt. We read Because They Wanted to in a feminist literature class I was taking. And what always stood out to me about Mary Gateskill is the precise yet creative use of language, where she has this ability to capture the nuance and the contradictions, especially of human behavior and human thought, because she's always in her characters' heads. But she does it through adjectives. She does it through adverbs, through specific, the way she mixes and matches her syntax. And that is so, nobody else I've ever read is able to do that.
Okay.
Where it's the language, just, it's what gets you so deep into the character's psyches. And I wish I was saying it more eloquently, right? But whenever I need to sort of remind myself what literature is capable of, I read Mary Gateskill.
Okay. Let's see. I have a bunch of questions. Tell us a little bit about how this collection came together. I'm always curious about short story collections, right? Did the writer say, I'm going to write a short story collection and sit down and write like 10 short stories all at one whop? Or are these short stories that you've written over years that you've kind of gone through your files and said, well, this makes sense to put together in a collection?
They were the only short stories I had, and I submitted them all to Scribner. But I mean, I've been writing pretty consistently for the past 10 years. And it's interesting because my last book, Dance on Saturday, a lot of those stories were actually Frankenstein stories, where a few got accepted by Small Beer Press, and they said, we like these, but these aren't exactly working. Do you have any others? And I'm like, yes, I did not. So I ended up cannibalizing a few pieces from maybe that I wrote in my 20s.
Okay.
And it feels like Weird Black Girls is definitely more the work of my 30s. The oldest piece in there is Triggered, which I wrote quite quickly.
All right.
And then there's other ones that I pecked away at, over the years. But those were the ones that I took to Scribner. These were the stories I had that felt finished, and the few didn't make the cut. I had one where Ja Rule flees to Mars.
Oh, I like it.
I don't know, maybe it'll see the light of day.
I kind of like the premise.
Yeah.
You do sci-fi really well. You do speculative really well. Why that particular genre? Like, why does that is something because all of your work is squarely based in sci-fi and speculative, and you do it really well. Talk to us a little bit about why is that your genre?
I'm very much into concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So a concept will come to me, like I'm working on a story now about a person who learns how to glitch like in a video game, because I'm watching video game playthroughs. And the idea of a glitch is it allows you to skip the hard parts and go straight to the end. And I'm like, oh, what if you could do that in real life?
Okay.
And skip the hard parts.
Right.
And how does that affect someone? And I start off with concepts and then I sort of go from there. Oh, what if you could glitch? What if there was a tree that, punished children? What if, the switch, right? That you use it to beat the children? What if there was some sort of, power, some eldritch power involved in that? And from there, I just start going forward and writing a piece.
Okay.
And sometimes I have pieces that conceptually I just don't see the fantasy in them, or I don't see the speculative element, and I know automatically that those are just straight literary pieces like Owen or Triggered.
And Owen is actually another one of my favorites in the book. And one of the things I think that stood out to me is that in almost every story, we see love relationships of some kind, whether they be the relationship, a man and a woman, or a romantic relationship, I should say, or filial love. And Owen is really about filial love. Can you tell us a little bit about how, like, that story and the father-son relationship? It's so poignant. Talk a little bit about the creation of that story and how those characters came to be.
Well, I saw my father recently, and I think he turned 76 this year.
Okay.
And Dad read the arc of the book, and Dad's like, I told you never put me in a story. And I said, well, Dad, that guy's a dentist. You're an optometrist. So obviously there's some background in there, personal background. And I always make sure to fictionalize things, because that's what makes it more interesting. But for that particular story, it's based on real life. When Owen Hart passed away, it affected me and my sister pretty deeply, because we were big professional wrestling fans.
I could tell.
So like I remember she like made Owen bracelets and went to school like wearing them, like R.I.P. Owen, that type of thing. And I look back, it's like that was probably my first real reckoning with mortality, was when he died. And I just got that idea of what if the father was helping the child through this. And I also thought, times when we buried our hamsters, right?
I thought about that as I was reading it. Yeah.
So combine like a pet funeral with a funeral for a stranger. And it just came together.
It works quite well. It really does. You mentioned a second ago the switching tree, which is told from the perspective of a young girl. What's it like to get into the headspace of a young girl? Because you're not.
I'm not, no. I don't know. I try and write from different perspectives.
You do a good job of it in this book.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I think it almost feels to me that the story could not have been told from a boy's perspective. And I think of, ideas of corporal punishment and the sort of pressures that are put on boys specifically. It didn't seem, and I know I'm not sounding very eloquent right now, but I think as somebody who did experience corporal punishment when I was a boy, my dad used to spank me, right? I'm thinking like, there's just seems something that's not gelling. So what if I told it from the perspective of a girl who she's looking from the outside at the type of expectations that are put on her brother.
Mhm.
Right.
It's almost like she's reporting
Yeah.
about the experiences of her brother as she's watching and the other kids in town until, well, I don't want to give you any spoilers, but yeah.
And it's the idea that, she gets punished, but she gets punished for, behaving differently from the way the girl is supposed to behave, right? So there's all these different expectations. I felt like this will be a more nuanced story if I look at it from the female perspective. So that's how it led to that.
Okay. What does that tree represent for you?
Do I have to answer that?
No, you don't have to answer any of these questions if you don't want to.
I don't know. It's like an eldritch horror. I don't like to give explanations.
Okay, that's fine with me. So let's talk about the fact that it's very steamy. There's a lot of sex in this book. It's hard to write sex scenes. I know because I've tried. Talk to us a little bit about how you're able to get the elements of a good sex scene into these stories without them feeling overly gratuitous and making them feel kind of seamless in terms of furthering the plot lines and having us have a better understanding of these characters.
I don't know. It's funny. It seems like the less sex I have in real life, the more of it my characters have. But I just look at it from everything is ultimately connected to the characters. And something like, Weird Black Girls, right? Where there's sex scenes, but it's always something that moves the plot forward. I think for, say, a story like for Caitlin Clark, there's a number of sex scenes. And for me, if you're trying to talk about a relationship, you're not just talking about the hardships. You're not just talking about the arguments. You're talking about the joy, right? And so much of the joy is in sex. And I very purposefully tried to narrow in on the happiness these characters felt in experiencing each other's bodies, and how the mystical element creates a complication in that, but there's also ways to work that into the pleasure. And it was very important. If I'm going to tell a love story, then sex needs to be a key element there, and the joy in sex. So I'm trying to think. Reunion.
Yes.
The characters spend a lot of time talking about sex.
They do.
And that's showing the closeness between the characters. So I don't know. I think it's also about just varying it, where, some of the sex scenes are joyful, some of them are disappointing, some of them are just things that the characters talk about.
Yes. Some of them also, at least one of them, I think, seems a little almost violent in nature. How do you kind of vary that?
Well, if I'm thinking correctly about the scene you're referring to, it's a story about an emotionally violent relationship.
Correct.
So, when they finally reach that, impasse, it's just as toxic as anything else.
Okay.
So that's the thing too. Sometimes sex is enjoyable, sometimes it's abusive. And I think it's just about looking at the different ways in which it's incorporated in people's lives, and knowing that it is an aspect of people's life, which is why it comes up in every single story that's about adult characters.
Right.
It's what we do.
It is what we do. You play with history in the final title story, Weird Black Girls, and you give us kind of this alternative history. What's it like to rewrite American history?
I mean, American history is historical fiction anyway.
Correct.
But that particular piece, I got really into the background work, and it was really fun because I discovered the magical city as I went along. So it started off like, okay, this is just Boston, and it's pointing upward like a finger. And then from there, I'm like, all right, there's more I can add here since it's my sandbox, right? And I think it was cool just going back and finding certain aspects of New England history and incorporating those. And I just always wanted to make sure that it was never really about the setting.
Okay.
You know, the setting is the sandbox in which this picaresque takes place, that it's all about the characters and the characters moving through the world and having a fantastical experience, which, you know, if you're talking speculative fiction, that's what you're doing, is you're taking, you know, what happens to us and you're blowing it up into a grand sort of narrative in order to talk about things that we actually can't talk about. How we talk about first love, right? How we put that into words, it's impossible. So the idea of them taking this vacation, you know, to this fantastic city, you know, it's ultimately representative of what's going on for them, which is a fantastic thing. These feelings that they're experiencing with each other, you know, in their 20s. And I look at, you know, all this stuff about fantastical Boston. For me, that's mainly the color. That's sort of like the razzmatazz, right? And always just making sure that no matter how fun it gets for me, that's never distracting from the narrative. You know, there's a whole long scene where they're just hanging out with their friends at a bar.
Right.
But they're hanging out at a bar in a magical city.
In a magical city. And then they're on a boat, a ship. That is quite entertaining. How'd that ship come to be?
Oh my God. I love it. You write too, you know, and I don't know if you have these moments where it's like, how did that idea come in my head? I don't know where it came from, but as soon as I had the image of an armada just stuck like Legos in the bottom of a giant landmass, everything fell into place. But I don't like it when things get boring. I'm like, man, these characters are walking too many streets. They
Guess
need to...
what? You have succeeded here because I was not bored. That is some party.
Yeah, I need to move them on a boat or something. These streets are getting monotonous. I need to switch things up here.
Now, have you spent time in Boston or?
Yeah, Boston's great.
Okay. No, I just wonder because you definitely capture, you know, the essence, I think.
Yeah, I think
of Boston.
I appreciate that. Because I never know. I'm always expecting somebody from Boston to come up and be like, it's not like that.
Oh no, I'm not from Boston, but I'm from New England. But then you also give us you take us on kind of a tour of the states, right? We're in Oakland sometimes, we're in Pittsburgh, where we know you've spent some time. How do you choose these settings? Is it places that you have experienced, or does it, you know, do you in your head say, well, I think it would be fun to set a story in this place?
I tend to write stories that take place in places that I've lived.
Okay.
Or places that I've traveled. Sometimes I break out and try to imagine, a specific place, but usually there's definitely an autobiographical aspect to everything I write, and I'm not going to pretend there isn't. So, I mean, Weird Black Girls is a combination of many trips that I've taken to Boston.
Okay.
And just thinking about all the different things that happened and combining them, because now that I have a setting, right, and I have a milieu, I can go from there. But a lot of my stories, especially nowadays, they focus on Oakland or they focus on Pittsburgh, because those are the main places that I've lived.
I wasn't clear where Switching Tree takes place. Clearly in the South.
Florida.
It is Florida. Okay.
It takes place outside of Fort Pierce, Florida.
Okay. I don't know Fort Pierce, so
I did a lot of fantasticating for that particular. Like, there's a point where Carrie Mae goes to the movies with Amos,
right?
And I had to ask myself, okay, how long would it take a pair of children to go from the swampland into the city to go to this movie theater, which may or may not have existed? Fantasticated.
You just said this word, and I'm like, I've never heard this word. Fantasticating. Talk about that. What for you? What does that mean?
looking at the real area as a type of mythological space, which is what I do in Switch and Tree.
Okay.
Where something like Weird Black Girls, even though I shake up the geography, I'm very into just having specific landmarks, and just being realistic about the time it would take to get between different places, because I can just look it up.
Right.
Whereas something like Switch and Tree, where it takes place almost 100 years ago, I can sort of play with that more fairy tale or folk tale type of atmosphere, and I just dig that. I've been to Florida. I haven't spent a lot of time there.
Okay.
So hopefully I did a good job.
It's a compelling story. It's when I started the book, because like when I do short story collections, sometimes I won't like go through them chronologically. I'll start in the middle sometimes, right? But I started with the first story in this, and I kept coming back to it throughout the entirety of the collection. I kept going back to Switch and Tree because there were so many little things in it that made me go, how did he do that? So good job. Good job. I want to ask you about the otter, but I fear it's going to be like the Switch and Tree, and you're not going to tell me like what were you thinking?
Ask me about what?
The otter with the otter with the crown on the.
Oh, the ferret.
Oh, yeah. Ferret, excuse me.
Yeah, he's the prince of the ferrets.
Yes, he is. But he's really big.
Yeah, I was reading the Arabian Nights when I wrote this story. I was teaching out in Dublin, at a school that shall not be named, but we were reading Arabian Nights, and there's so much just lush language, and there's so much in there about transformation and, oh Lord of Givings, you have broken the spell of the genie who blah 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 and
you nailed it with the ferret, because he totally comes out of nowhere and he is like fantastical, and he makes you go, what just happened? So good job on that one too.
Yeah, the ferret is very much an Arabian Nights protagonist
with his crown.
Yeah. So you know he's a prince. Else he's just a regular ferret.
So you told us at the beginning, or we learned at the beginning that you are about to jump into novel writing, or you're dabbling with novels right now. So what's it like to go from short stories to novels?
It's hard for me. I finished the draft about 5 months ago. I'm working on another draft for Scribner, and the impulse was so strong to write every single chapter as its own story. So for me, that's something I had to break myself out of and actually think, okay, what I'm doing here, I could spread out over several chapters. And maybe it's different for people who start with novel writing. I've been writing short stories for so long. That's my natural impulse, is to go episodic.
Right.
But I think once I broke out of that, I finally found the story.
Okay.
And it's an experience. I mean, I don't know, climbing a mountain is an experience, but writing a novel is another type of experience, right? Where sort of like breaking these habits and like focusing very much on the narrative, right? Because you have to have a narrative that continues all through the book and that feels cohesive, but always keeping the language present too. Where when I'm writing my novel, I'm constantly going back and reading poetry to help with the novel writing process, so that I never get so caught up in, see spot run to get from the beginning of the chapter to the end of the chapter that I'm losing the art of it.
I think we might want to open it up to some questions right now. I'm sure you have some. And I'm gonna give you this mic.
Thank you.
So anybody?
So it was brought up that you talk about specific place, and I happen to have insider information that you've been traveling a lot. And is it in order to find those more specific places and just explore stories in different parts of the world for you?
Yes. I'm working on a vampire story that takes place in Mexico. So I spent a month in Mexico. I wrote a play about Alexander Dumas. So I spent a couple months in France. Give myself an excuse to go to France, basically. I'll have to justify it somehow so you can write it off as a tax deduction when you go out there. But yeah, it's research, travel. Yeah, it all factors in there.
You talked about reading poetry to help you for writing your novel and to help you not lose sight of the art. You are a short story author, so I'm wondering, did you read any short stories or specifically poetry, and why the specific mix?
For this, well, I definitely think poetry came up a lot in writing the novel. I think going back to short stories when I was writing the novel turned out to be counterintuitive, so I wasn't doing that so much. Writing every single story in this book, I mean, I've said this in interviews before, is that there's always sort of like a lodestone, what I'm going for in any particular story. So for instance, the Switch and Tree, Thomas Ligotti was my lodestone, or Triggered, Joyce Carol Oates was my lodestone, where every time I feel like I'm veering away or I'm not really being successful, what I'm going for, I'm like, I've seen this done successfully by this writer. Tournament Arc, Neil Gaiman was my lodestone. So I definitely have writers who I'm always returning to. And then, things get mixed up, like I didn't think of Zora Neale Hurston when I'm writing particular pieces, but ultimately she became a lodestone. Tama Janowitz became a lodestone during the actual writing of the pieces. So like when I'm writing short stories, I'm very much going back to short stories because short stories and longer pieces, novels, novellas are not interchangeable. You have to engage with the brevity. And the only way to do that is to, read people who write in that genre. In my opinion, that's how it works for me.
So I have a question. Are you ever haunted by any of your stories?
That's an interesting one, as shown by the gasps in the audience. I would say no. I'm haunted by the stories I'm about to write. That's what I think about at night when I can't go to sleep, is what do I want to do with this particular piece that I'm working on? So once I put a story out there, once it gets published, once it gets printed, that ghost has been exorcised. And then on to the next ghost.
Anyone else? One last chance. Oh.
You mentioned earlier about structure. Were there, what was the most complex structure you were grappling with in this collection?
I would say the title story, because it's a picaresque, and I very much set out thinking this cannot have, I don't want to say not have a plot, because obviously it does. All picaresque have plots, but it cannot be driven by that plot that need to get from one point to another, to another, to another. So fighting that instinct to make things plot driven, but also having a form where it takes place over a weekend. So I have to be judicious about where the characters go and what they do. There's only 24 hours in a day. But also making sure that I don't fall into the place where, okay, I need a conflict here, right? The conflict is what the characters bring in themselves. And they're working out that conflict all throughout the picaresque. There's no rising action to this and that. They start off with a conflict, and it's about them working through it the same way that a lot of people do so in real life, right? So working with that picaresque structure was a challenge. And everything else, I think, came about pretty naturally. Like Caitlin Clark has a circular narrative I didn't even think about, I just wrote it. or a reunion where it starts off with the list of things they're going to talk about, and then they talk about it. I'm not thinking about it because I'm just in the conversation, right? But Weird Black Girls had a lot of going back and editing, and there's a whole scene involving a kaiju that got taken out because it wasn't. Why did it get taken out? Anyway, I don't remember why we did. Probably because it made the piece too long, right? But you're working within the form. And I think that experimentation with picaresque, something I'd never done before, and a specific challenge that I made for myself, was definitely hard, but worked in the end.
The question was, how do you approach revision?
I have very helpful editors at Scribner who will tell me what to do. Not the first time. I worked with Kelly and Gavin at Small Beer Press. But for the second time, I have that really hands-on team, which is great because I'm not gonna find these things out by myself. I'm just gonna write a 150-page short story, and so no, it was a team effort.
Anybody else? We have time to have you read a little bit more for some latecomers. Maybe a little excerpt.
Sure. How much time?
2 or 3 pages is good.
2 or 3 pages. Okay. What?
Ooh, read from. Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
If you would read, please, from either Triggered or The Switching Tree.
Okay. Let's do Switching Tree. Okay. Harvest season became hurricane season. I'm on page 6 if anybody has a copy. Watching Pa pickle Yellowtail in the smokehouse, I knew this storm would be vicious. Winds made the pine trees loll side to side and grunt like frustrated men, and so did the pine wood moan in our porch, as if the living and the dead were speaking to one another. For 3 days we stayed inside, subsisting on fish and other reserves, while all the swamp supplicated outside the rattling window. I prayed for the demon to perish in the torrent, dared to hope our humiliation over, when the clouds departed like a fleet of burnt piraguas above the weeping cypress. Then came planting season. On our walk to school, we passed felled palmettos. We went to class. At recess, I hung around the boys in hopes they picked me for their ball games. One day, word spread that a terrible thing happened to Amos Barnes. We gathered in a small group at the edge of the yard, around the log where Amos sat, spindly and gape-mouthed, hair cropped and curly. Afraid to talk at first, he gave in after we all screamed at him, perhaps none louder than myself. What happened was, on the way back from school, Amos, feeling grown, called out, "Howdy, Edna," to Miss Edna on her porch. Addressing any grown-up like that, let alone a woman of Miss Edna's stature, was an execution-worthy offense. Naturally, she set for the Barnes cabin to tell Amos's mom, her words a bullet in the chamber as soon as Mr. Barnes came home. First, Amos's daddy punched the freckles off of him, Amos's words. Then he sent the boy for a switch. But whenever Amos tried pulling the branch off a cherry tree or china berry, a breeze whisked the limb out of reach. So he returned home and, according to Amos, who lacked the imagination for guile, the pecan in their yard gave his daddy instructions, in a voice Mr. Barnes at first took for his beloved grandmother. It forced him to the ground, same as happened to our pa. "I can still feel the switch," Amos murmured. It was like getting hit with pure hate. "From the pecan?" asked Jesse quietly. For a second, his eyes met mine. "Nah." Subsequently, he described following his daddy over the bridge, where the tree waited for them, and every word out of his mouth put strain on my bladder. Of all things the hurricane felled, the devil survived. Indeed, I wondered if it could die. or if we'd stumbled upon a creature as immortal as demons who torment sinners eternally. After Amos's story, his words linger like acrid smoke in the air. Jesse sat in the grass with his knees to his chest. He knew better than to share what we knew, but he was thinking about the whooping. Pure hate. Then, from the crowd, someone chuckled. It's weird you're all scared of a tree, declared Carrie Mae Sawyer. She'd been sitting to my left, a chubby, blonde, sunburnt mulatto who excelled at granting wishes. For example, our teacher, Miss Sandra, took joy when Carrie Mae's hand shot up like a dandelion all day. The church ladies celebrated their successful efforts to imbue the youth with Pentecostal values when Carrie Mae offered to do charity. That I knew her blue polka dot dress and penny loafers hid a mendacious nature made me feel like the keeper of a maddening secret. You calling him a fibber? I challenged, trying to look mean and at the same time hold my piss. Pink like bubblegum, her lips veered sideways when she smiled, a saucy expression borrowed from her mother. You mean a liar? Ooh, I'm telling. She said lie. I'm telling. Shut up, Jesse cut me off harshly. You ain't telling nobody. We weren't supposed to say shut up either, but I got the point. It was hard to keep secretive with Carrie Mae spouting bad words. In any case, she went on. Amos would never fib. He says it's real, it's real. I hope the tree get you, I said. Artificial innocence quivered her gray eyes. But doesn't your daddy work at a sawmill? He cuts trees all day. If he's not afraid, I shan't be afraid. If only I was Jackie Robinson. Then I could take a Louisville slugger and knock that round white head right off her shoulders. Unable to stop the pressure any longer, I dashed into the brush, looking for all the world like I was fleeing Carrie Mae, to unbutton my overalls, squat, and wet the mud for what felt like forever. Thank you.